So we're really thrilled to have distinguished moderator and 3 speakers today join us. They're each going to give a very short presentation. We told them 7 minutes. Can you imagine? 7 minutes. It's hard to do anything in 7 minutes. But I'm pleased to introduce Jennifer Robson, who's an associate professor and director of graduate program at Carleton University, who will be moderating the panel. I'm not going to read bios, by the way, for one, because it's very painful as a speaker to have someone read your bio. And they're all available in the Slido. So if you get to that link tree, you can read about anyone's backgrounds in there as well. We'll also have Pedro Antunes, the chief economist at the Conference Board of Canada, one of our consortium partners. Dr. Glenda Quintini, a senior economist at OECD, will be joining us virtually from Paris. And Dr. Wendy Cukier from the Diversity Institute. So I'll hand it over to you, Jen. Thank you.
Good morning. Bonjour. When it comes to public policy, as I always tell my students, what gets measured gets minded, right? So good data helps us to identify Canada's human capital challenges and the opportunities that we have in front of us. Ça nous permet aussi un dialogue fondé sur les données probantes, sur la situation actuelle que nous faisons face, mais aussi sur la direction que nous prenons ensemble. When connected to policy interventions, policy change, program level interventions, good data can also let us see what's working and also what's not, so that we make smarter investments. So we have an excellent panel to help us make sense of the data that we have and what it's telling us about how to secure Canada's future prosperity. I will not obviously repeat the introductions, so thank you very much to Tricia for making my job up here a little easier. But first we'll be hearing from Pedro Antunes, followed by Dr. Glenda Quintini and Dr. Wendy Cukier. So they will each speak for a few minutes. Also remind you that you can be part of this conversation by joining the Slido, so please submit your questions because there will be time for questions at the end of the session. So, without further ado, Pedro, can I invite you up?
Yeah, terrific. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Ça fait plaisir d'être ici de retour. The last time I presented, I think, with FSC was at an event in Montreal, and I started off by saying I don't know that I have any very much good news at all for folks, and here I am. I got invited back, so that's not bad. Yeah, I thought I'd give you the bad news first. I'll talk about the situation in the labor market in Canada and how we are seeing the economy evolve. And then I'll introduce a little bit of how economists look at our potential in our economy, and in fact dive into a little bit of some of the drivers of essentially our GDP, which is our income, and our productivity. And so I'll start with that, and I think we're going to have some of our other panelists dig deeper into some of the performance indicators that are important around productivity. All right, so people and potential. It's a good title. I think AI helped me with that. If you folks are worried about a trade war between the 2 biggest economies in the world, the U.S. and China, well, let me put your hearts at ease here, because President Trump announced just yesterday that he and Xi are very close, very good friends, and it's just that Xi gets a little testy sometimes, so I'm sure things will get resolved. But in fact, we're very worried about the current situation. The 2 biggest economies in the world. The U.S. at current exchange rates is about 26% of the world economy. The U.S. consumer is still roughly 80% of global demand. And China at current exchange rates is about 16% of the world economy, and they are in a testy situation, the 2 of them. So that in and of itself is going to have an impact on the global outlook, and of course that has an impact on Canada's economy, not to mention the impact of direct tariffs on a lot of our production, a lot of our goods that we're already seeing, but even beyond that, it's the impact on confidence. And the impact on confidence is one that is affecting both business and consumer confidence, and it's really showing up on the investment side. Businesses are hand-tied in terms of their investment, and they're hand-tied in terms of their employment. So this chart just has essentially the quarterly growth rates for Canada. You can see that in the second quarter, we just got the news from StatsCan not that long ago, we had essentially a big decline in economic activity, 1.6% decline in economic activity. That did follow a strong ramp up. In fact, part of the reason that we're not seeing yet the biggest impacts of these tariff wars and trade wars is that we got ahead of the tariffs. Exports from many countries into the U.S., including Canada's, ramped up in the first quarter, but now we're starting to see essentially that exports for Canada into the U.S. are about 6-7% below normal. So that is going to take a bite out of growth, and that's what's happening in the second quarter, in the third quarter, the fourth quarter of this year. We're hopeful that we'll see a little bit of pickup in economic, essentially economic activity going forward as we get into next year. But it is really a hope. We're hopeful that we'll see some stability in terms of the tariffs, that we'll work out some tariff agreement with the U.S. And that's the GDP growth. That represents, by the way, for this year in Canada, 1.1% growth. That's half of our normal pace of growth should be in Canada. And for next year, for 2026, that quarterly pattern works out to about 1.3% growth for next year. So both years very weak. And you can see the employment picture there. It's just essentially very, very lackluster. Flat employment or almost no employment growth is our expectation over the next 2 years. That's the demand side, essentially the employment growth. What about the supply side? And we heard a little bit about this morning, the immigration story. That's just a complete about-face. The light blue bars, by the way, that's the non-permanent resident stream. That's international students, that's refugees, and that's temporary foreign workers, some of the programs that are included in those numbers. Over the 3 years, essentially well over 1 million people came into this country over those 3 years, and we're looking at reducing those numbers. So the light blue bars now are below zero. That means roughly, according to the federal government, plans of essentially seeing 950,000 people out of the country over 2 years. We've worked it over 3 years in the assumptions in our forecast, but that essentially means flat population growth over the next 2 years. The federal government actually had a slight decline in population growth. And we talked about how should I say, we talked about retirements as well this morning. Those numbers, that, how should I say, outflow out of the labor force continues to happen in Canada. I'm running very quickly out of time, so let me just say the supply and demand side means a tightening labor market, a slowly tightening labor market. We saw the unemployment rate, we think, peak at about 7.3% just a few months ago. It's at 7.1% now. We expect that to slowly ease because the decline in the supply is greater than essentially the ramp up, essentially stable employment growth going forward. And just very quickly on the youth unemployment rates, I just want to point out here, the biggest, we haven't really seen big declines except for the 15 to 19-year-olds. So often we hear about the 15 to 24, but it is very, very much axed on that very young group, 15 to 19-year-olds, and this is why we're seeing very high unemployment rates for those folks. And that, to me, doesn't signal necessarily, it signals the impacts of a weak economy. It doesn't yet signal the impact of disruptive forces on the workforce. So a productivity emergency, we keep hearing about it from, our Bank of Canada's Deputy Governor, Carolyn Rogers. She keeps talking about productivity emergency. Economists break productivity into essentially a very simple framework. We look at the whole economy as though it were a firm, and we say, well, there's 3 things that are going to drive output in that firm: the amount and quality of labor, the amount and quality of capital, physical productive capital like machinery and equipment, and the efficiency with which that mixes to create output. Now, the efficiency piece is all of that stuff that we talk around innovation, possibly AI, possibly the management practices, all of these things. The capital piece is one where we've been very, very lackluster, and in fact we're hearing a lot about Prime Minister Carney's efforts at pushing private investment to drive up our capital. And the last is the quality of labor. Now, I'm just going to go to very quickly to what our Nobel laureate we just heard about, Peter Howitt, you may have heard, and his whole thesis was around creative destruction. And what that means is that in an economy, we're not seeing, it's not like the rising tide lifting all industries at the same time. Economic growth is driven by strength in some areas, displacing weaknesses in other areas, and that's what happens with destructive growth in the economy. And the other thing he says is the way to the policies that we need to how should I say, to adapt to that are really around human capital. It's around, essentially retraining, reskilling our workforce to adapt to these changes. And right now, we're seeing massive, massive investments in AI. This is driving billions of dollars in these data centers. It's driving billions of investments in new power capacity. This is what's driving the economy, and of course, it's going to have repercussions elsewhere. So that creative destruction is happening. The good news is that we're already starting to see that on the innovation side, on the efficiency side of the economy. I think we'll hear more from other panelists. I'm a little over time, apologies, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. So if my notes are correct, I think through the miracle of technology, we'll be now joined by Dr. Glenda Quintini, who's joining us virtually from the OECD. Is that correct? Can I have a signal?
I am here, so thank you. Can you hear me? Fine. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I can hear myself, but I hope it's better for you. Let me try and put the presentation. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I was told 5 minutes, so I guess I have the extra 2 minutes at my disposal. I'm starting, I think, at a good time, at a good point, because that's where the previous speaker left on productivity per hour worked. He's already said so many valuable things on this, but what I can do perhaps that he didn't do is compare Canada internationally with other OECD countries. You see that productivity per hour worked in Canada is close to the OECD average, is still far from the best performing countries on the left of the chart. There's been a significant slowdown. We saw that in the chart of the previous speaker as well in productivity growth, and this slowdown is common in other countries, but has been bigger in Canada, which means that Canada's position has slipped down. And as the previous speaker has mentioned, of course, having a skilled workforce is essential for productivity growth. It's important for adopting new technology, for innovating, for improving processes. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Canada has a very qualified workforce, this hasn't really translated into big productivity gains. And what I'm going to show in the next two slides is that in international comparison, this seems to be due to bigger difficulties in Canada in translating education outputs, putting skills into use in the labor market. So here you see what I just said. Canada has a very qualified labor force compared to other countries. So the share of the population holding a tertiary degree is the highest in Canada compared to other OECD countries. Participation in lifelong learning, so after leaving education, is very high, both in terms of returning to formal education, but also training on the labor market, or both for some adults. There are gaps, so there are significant differences between groups. So for example, the low skilled tend to participate less than the high skilled, and the gap is pretty large, and it's increased over the past decade. This is also by age. So Canada, for example, has the biggest gap in participation in adult learning by age, where older workers participate a lot less than the young. Let's say that this also participation in adult learning has not moved much over the past decade. This is common among other countries as well. So there's been either stagnation in participation rates, or in some cases participation fell, which is not the case for Canada, where it remains stable. So, as I said, there is, though, not as close link between the level of qualification and information processing skills. So, while Canada has the most highly educated labor force and population in OECD countries, you see that in terms of information processing skills, it does quite well, but it's not at the top. So, there is, in fact, the fact that qualifications don't translate as much into literacy scores or numeracy scores or problem solving as well as in Japan, Sweden, or the Netherlands, for example. So this also is reflected in the rewards for skills on the labor market. There's for the same level of skills, workers in several OECD countries earn higher wages than they do in Canada. And you can also see that the difference is mostly due to the ability of the labor market to reward higher skills, so those who have the highest level of skills, while the rewards for the low skilled is more comparable across countries. There's also a high overqualification rate. So these are workers who have qualifications that are significantly higher than qualification required by their job, which again means that there isn't a full use of the skills of these workers on the labor market. And finally, I want to conclude with a little bit of insights on the policy side, since this evidence all suggests that Canada is not using skills to the full. I just want to show you a few insights from our Skills First Adoption Readiness and Adoption Index, which we launched just last Friday, which measures the extent to which countries are focusing on skills as opposed to qualification or occupational experience, and how they're advancing this, and the potential of adopting a skills-first approach is to broaden the talent pool, to facilitate, to enable more mobility, and also to solve also information asymmetries which might be at the origin, for example, of overqualification. You see that Canada doesn't score very high on any of the dimensions. We measure the extent to which skills are signaled, recognized, and rewarded. We measure the extent to which education, training, and career guidance providers focus on skills when they provide their programs. And we look at the enabling framework, that is the infrastructure and the incentives to move towards a skills-first approaches. And the pressure for Canada to do that is quite high. We also have, as part of the index, a labor market pressure index, which measures shortages, pressures for upskilling and reskilling, for example. You see that Canada is on the bottom right, which means that of the chart on the left, which means that the pressure from the labor market to adopt a skills-first approaches is high, and so there is a lot to gain in this move, but Canada is further behind than other countries in doing that. And I'll stop here. I hope I'm within my time. Thanks a lot.
Survey we do with the Environics Institute and FSC, and it shows that, I would argue, despite the fact that certain sectors are more at risk of disruption from trade, technology, and so on, all Canadians are worried about their jobs, and that's partly because of the multiplier effects of job loss in certain sectors, which will eventually ripple through the whole economy. The other thing that I think is interesting is looking at AI use. And it's important to emphasize that the way in which people understand AI use varies dramatically. So Stats Canada did a study of small medium enterprises that said about 11% are using AI in operations, whereas there are other surveys that say it's more than 50% of SMEs, and a lot depends on how you define AI use. But what we see is AI use among employees is growing. And in fact, it's growing faster than the leaders in many of these organizations say they're using AI. That creates massive opportunity, but also massive risk, because half of the people who say they're using AI in the workplace have no formal training, no guardrails, and we know that that's a real problem. The other thing that's very interesting, in my view, about the advent of generative AI is it's bridging the digital divide in many ways. So the gap between men and women has narrowed dramatically. If you asked about coding skills, you'd see something very, very different. And that's partly because generative AI is the English major's revenge. So after all of that emphasis on coding, more computer scientists, guess what? Those are jobs that are disappearing, and prompt engineering requires the ability to think critically and structure a sentence. So we're tracking all of this through a disaggregated lens because it is really important, again, when you think about what the minister said, to consider the impacts of all of these changes and the disruption on different segments of the population. The other thing that I think is so important, and this is when we think about the data that was presented by the conference board or the international data, is to consider the structure of the Canadian economy. Canada is a country of small, medium enterprises. Most private sector employment is with small, medium enterprises, over 90%. In contrast, in the US, it's 50%. Big companies have lots of money to spend on technology and HR and all kinds of things. So the productivity gaps we see are partly a function of the structure of our economy, and I think we have to continue to emphasize that. What large corporations want and need, very different from what small, medium enterprises need. What the health sector needs, very different from what manufacturing needs. And if we don't take a very close look at the disaggregated data, we're going to miss the boat, in my view. So one of the things we did with the with Memorial University was look at AI adoption among SMEs. And again, we asked different questions than other studies, but what we see is lots of small, medium enterprises are starting to use AI. The use cases, the impact is very uneven. Part of the reason we have a productivity paradox around investments in technology, some companies get really good gains and some are pouring money down a big black hole. And so often it evens out. What we have to focus on is how to use technology effectively to drive productivity, creative destruction, and innovation. Skills and competency frameworks, in our view, and we'll talk more about skills afterwards, critically important. I would argue, regardless of the analysis that says some jobs will be more affected by AI than others, we need AI literacy for everybody. It has to be part of it doesn't matter what job you're in, because you're going to be targeted by deep fakes and cybersecurity threats. If you don't have basic AI literacy, you're at risk. We also need deep AI skills. We need more Nobel Prize winners and PhDs in machine learning. But what we really need, and this is true whether we're talking about AI or green transition, we need people who understand organizations, human behavior, policy and ethical frameworks, and can ensure effective adoption. Because without adoption, you have no innovation. And we have spent too much time, in my view, focusing on developing technologies, whether it's green tech, AI tech, you name it, and not enough attention on how to use those technologies to achieve benefits for all Canadians. And that has implications. It's also important to recognize, and I think the evidence is very clear on this, that part of the reason why we see that gap between our education levels and productivity and employment frankly, is bias at multiple levels. And the experiences, and again, this is the Skills and Employment Survey, the experiences of different segments of the population of discrimination in the workplace. This is based on 40,000 responses, like it's 8 waves of 5,000 respondents, is profound. And what may surprise you is people in the nonprofit sector and government sectors report higher levels of discrimination than in the private sector. And that's something we could talk about further. But it's the underutilization of skills all through organizations. The other thing that is critically important is to see the differences. So women still experience barriers. Lots of people think gender is dead. It's not. But we also see that within, for example, the racialized community, Black people experience more discrimination. And where this plays out, which is really important, is when we look at Indigenous peoples. Indigenous university graduates have pretty much the same employment outcomes as non-Indigenous people. That may surprise people in the room. But Indigenous peoples are much less likely to graduate from university, which means you have to invest upstream. It's very different for Black people. We've bridged the gap between Black people and people who are not Black in terms of university graduation, but Black people are far more likely to be employed in jobs only requiring high school education. Persons with severe disabilities who have graduated from universities have worse employment outcomes than high school dropouts. This is not, frankly, just about skills. This is about tackling barriers to work and education. And, you know, one of the most shameful things is the fact that in Canada, on average, immigrants earn 50% of Canadian-born workers after 5 years in the country. 50%, whether they're doctors, engineers, whatever. In Australia, it's 90%. We have a long way to go. And the solutions, and we'll talk more about this, of course I'm over time too, is really to take an ecosystem approach, to understand that we need policies, we need to respond to those global geopolitical economic trends. We have to deal with skill requirements at the individual level. But what I would challenge everyone in the room to think about is how we can drive change in the institutions, whether it's post-secondary, whether it's the service providers, whether it's the employers, to create a more inclusive and productive ecosystem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy. Okay, so I know you have the QR codes on your table, so I would encourage you please to submit your questions through Slido. While you're thinking about the questions you want asked, let me start off our question session with a few prepared questions of my own. All three of our speakers have raised the question of productivity. It's the word on many lips these days. In turn, so I'll start with you, Pedro, and then go to you, Glenda, and finish off with you, Wendy. Help us in this room make sense of the fact that on the one hand, Canada has high rates of adult learning participation, high education attainment, and yet low productivity. Like, I thought that more human capital was better, isn't it? What's going on?
Oh, well, yeah. Just one point on that very quickly. The human capital aspect has been a steady contributor to labor productivity. That was my last chart, which shows kind of this very smooth, about 0.3 percentage points per year. Now, what is labor productivity? It's output per hour worked. It's income. GDP or output, it's just income. Labor income and essentially the income that's attributed to profits. So it's our what drives our prosperity and what drives government revenues, what drives essentially our ability to offer public services. Everything is really tied to that metric. Is really important. The other thing I'd say is where we're lagging. It's on the capital side. And this is where I was referencing Carolyn Rogers' point. She used the example. She was in Halifax at the time. I think they just had a major snowstorm there. And she said, if you have a snowblower versus a shovel, you're going to get a lot more done per hour worked. So the capital component is one that we absolutely need to address. It's a little different than what we're talking about here. And then the last is the efficiency piece, which, you know, as I said, I think we need to dig deeper. But what's the positive news is that that efficiency piece is getting better in Canada. It's been really dismal in let's say the last decade. It has been getting better in the last few years, and I think there's something attributed to technology, to AI. So there's hope in that aspect.
Thank you. Glenda, can I turn to you for an international perspective?
Yes, I think I tried to do that a little bit in the presentation. What I would say is that qualifications don't directly translate into skills, which then don't automatically translate into a good use of skills. And I think a speaker that followed me also made that point, right? So the purpose of the survey of adult skills, which we released last year, is precisely to disentangle that relationship between having a qualifications and acquiring skills. So there's I think it's intuitive, you know, there's a variation of skills that people acquire when the people possess, even if they have the same qualification. And we see internationally that countries that have even not as high qualification levels as Canada have higher levels of literacy, numeracy, and problem solving. And then the next step is, how are these skills used in the labor market? And that's why Diana was talking about skills first approaches. So approaches that focus on skills, and they do address some of the issues that were raised. For example, the fact that there might be also discrimination and bias at hiring. You know, if you look at the skills people have, irrespective of how they have been acquired, whether they come from a qualification, whether they come from work experience, or whether they come from a short training that people have done after finishing education, is very important. You're opening up to groups that normally you don't hire in your typical responding to your typical vacancy. So it also, to some extent, broadens diversity within occupations, which I think, again, is very important for that element of translating skills into use on the labor market.
Thank you. Wendy, I think this is where you come in.
Yeah, I think the thing is the definitions of skills are often unclear. So we know, for example, there's big focus placed on official language skills. We know that that does not translate into employment, though it does translate into earning potential. So what's going on there? Are we not measuring the right thing, or are people facing bias? We also know digital skills, you know, do surveys of business. We need digital skills, digital skills. You dig in on it. What was really interesting, this is a few years old, but it still applies today. Businesses said they wanted digital skills. Only 10% wanted deep digital skills like programming. About 15% wanted advanced use of platforms that might or might not need a computer science degree. 75% meant use of Microsoft Office. Right? So we have some really serious problems. In translation, you survey university grads and ask them about communication skills, 90% will say, yeah, I've got communication skills. Ask employers, 70% say no, because they're talking about different things. So I think that's really important to consider as well.
So we've been mixing up credentials and skills, and we're talking about totally different things when it comes to skills. I'm going to pick up on this the same thread with one of the questions from Slido. There's a question here which I think is interesting. Are Canadians overeducated or overskilled for the jobs that are available? Wendy, would you like to start us on this one?
I would argue not, because I'm a big believer, despite the fact a recent survey, and again, not to disagree with the minister, but 54% of Canadians said they would advise the young person to do trades, and only 26% would advise them to do a general university degree, which is really concerning to me, because I'm a big believer in building capacity and resiliency and critical skills and so on, as opposed to focusing narrowly on specific paths, because in my own experience, those paths change quite dramatically. So I would not argue we're overeducated. I would argue that we have not harnessed the talent, and I'll talk more about this later. We talk about creative destruction. We need to really center skills around entrepreneurship and innovation, whether people want to start a business, want to drive change in a university, or build a new healthcare system.
Thank you. Pedro, can I invite you? And then I'll turn to you, Glenda.
Yeah, just, well, real quickly, I think certainly on the immigration front, there's an issue around recognizing credentials, and I think that's an issue the Conference Board has done research in the past. So I would just highlight that again. That continues to be a challenge. So we do have people with high educational attainment, but that aren't necessarily working in their field. I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Glenda.
I think I'm just going to support what Wendy was saying, you know, the lump of labor fallacy. So let's not fall into the idea that then it's better to tell people not to go to university. The demand is not fixed, and so having a skilled workforce will also increase the demand for skilled workers. Of course, it takes some time, so the level of overqualification is also there in the adjustment phase. But maybe another point is also that qualifications are not abstract, right? They are qualification in a specific field. And we know that overqualification is often associated to certain fields of study because perhaps career guidance could be done better so that young people understand what the prospects are in each field that they choose. And the other side, which is also for employers, also to understand that skills are portable. So that, again, what I was saying before, right? Maybe a graduate in philosophy has skills that are valuable in a job that doesn't normally hire philosophers, but there are rigidities on both sides. So there are perhaps choices not guided by labor market demand and the rigidity from employers to hire young people who would have graduated from a field that's not the typical field they hire from.
Thank you. If we can get the Slido questions back up on the screen. There we go. Terrific. Okay. The one that I have at the top here of the list is kind of near and dear to my heart as a faculty member at a university. How can we better utilize our colleges and universities to support a skills-first approach to higher education and contribute to reskilling initiatives? All right, what's the role for the higher education sector? Actually, Glenda, could I ask you to start us on this conversation?
Yes, and so one of the components of our skills first indicators that we just issued was precisely the extent to which the education system and then also the training system and career guidance system embed skills in their program. So the extent to which programs, curricula are built around learning outcomes, but also skills that speak to the skills required in the labor market. So I think the countries that do best globally tend to be countries where there's a lot of stakeholder engagement, including in determining the content of education. These are countries also where updating the content of qualifications or, at the level of initial education is faster. It takes a long time to change curricula. So there's also a value in identifying agile ways to make sure that curricula includes skills that are required on the labor market. So I think these two elements are probably important.
Having survived one or two curriculum reforms myself, I couldn't agree more. Wendy, would you like to add?
Can I get fired? No, I have tenure. Universities, and I was Vice President of Research and Innovation. Universities like to talk about innovation. They don't like to change. And so we really need to rethink what we're doing. That being said, I did a master's degree in medieval history. I wouldn't trade for anything. Most people working in universities have never worked outside of universities. So we have to recognize that if someone is teaching in an English faculty, maybe they'll do digital humanities, maybe they can add things here and there, but it's ridiculous in my view to expect them to suddenly embrace preparing their students for employment tracks. I think what we have to do is really focus on some of the skills for success. Like if you're graduating from university, you probably, even in the age of Gen AI, should be able to read, write, and do basic arithmetic or have some financial literacy or something. But and there are professional schools like engineering, business, and so on, that are, or nursing, that are very clearly targeting pathways to employment. But where I see the huge opportunity is in thinking of new and innovative approaches to take a history major or a philosophy grad and give them some intensive training and work-integrated learning to open up the doors to employment. And that's where I remember getting a bunch of money from the province of Ontario to develop exactly a program like that, and being screamed at for half an hour by senior administrators because I was implying that, you know, arts grads did not have the skills to be employed. So we have real issues at the structural and cultural level in post-secondary. Good thing is we have some leaders who understand stuff needs to change, but it needs to change really, really quickly if we're going to survive.
Thank you. Pedro, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I could add something outside of that. I would say, you know, obviously we're talking about the supply side here. If we talk about the university programs, I would say we need to focus on the demand side, and we do that by educating students and by informing them, or young people, and informing them about what the opportunities are, what the outcomes are, and have them kind of set the agenda that they want to be and the path that they want to take. And I do think that there is a bias on trades. I do think that, you know, I was just talking to a young person the other day whose brother took on a trade, who he's essentially working for the public service, and he says, well, you know, I should have thought twice about this because my brother's making a lot more than I am in the role that he's got. So I think the education, and we're doing a lot of that with this, the FSC, we're doing a lot of that at the conference board with some of the metrics that we're gathering. I think this is a really important piece that there's not enough attention paid to it.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question here about, well, basically enrich the pie or grow the pie. So given the unemployment data, how do we determine whether the priority should be upskilling, reskilling versus expanding the labor pool? Pedro, why don't you start us on this one?
Well, I think both are important. Expanding the labor pool, I think there's been mistakes made in terms of what happened with immigration over the post-pandemic years and now the pushback against immigration. We need to get through this period and then resettle on an immigration rate that allows us, first of all, I think it should be more focused on the permanent stream, and it should be focused on the skills that we need and the occupations that we need to close the gaps on, and it should be steady and stable. And what we need perhaps is you know, an immigration that drives our population growth around 1% a year, like it's been for the past 30 years prior to you know, 23, 24, those couple of years, and that allows it's a better situation if you have slight growth rather than stagnant growth. There's more opportunity for businesses, etc. But of course, the other piece is the productivity piece, and we absolutely need to focus on that. I would say first and foremost, we need to encourage and be competitive on our ability to attract investment. That's a really important one. But then all of the other pieces that are going to add to the innovation side, to the skills that we're talking about, to ensuring that we are adopting and adapting to the new tech and the AI that's coming. I think that this is huge, and we've done, again, some work looking at the potential for AI. It's going to be very, very changing and disruptive, and we need to be able to adapt and reskill to that as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Wendy, I know you've made the point about having a strategy that is more inclusive of the labor pool that we have. Would you like to say more words on that?
Well, you know, women are half the workforce, persons with disabilities now 27%, and people who identify as racialized about 25%. Cities like Toronto, half the population's born outside the country, and another 25%. I have parents who were born outside the country, and people who identify as part of the 2S LGBTQ+ community are not only growing, but so are their allies. So to me, equity, diversity, and inclusion is not about wokeness. It's about marketing 101. The population's changing. So our strategies have to change as well. But in order to do that appropriately, we need disaggregated data. And I think one of the best things the previous government did was reinstate the long-form census. Some of the work that's been done really helps us understand some of those points that I mentioned. So if you want to drive in, and Juan Marseille, who used to work for Future Skills and now leads the Seven Generations Institute, and I were talking, if you want to really address economic reconciliation for Indigenous peoples, you have to recognize what the issues really are in terms of dealing with fundamental historic problems and genocide, racism, and the impact that that has on relationships with institutions. So it's not enough to support Indigenous institutes. That's important. It's not enough for post-secondary institutions to say we support truth and reconciliation and have special programs. You've got to invest upstream. And there's just no way around that. It's going to be more expensive than helping my kid get through school, but that's because we are addressing historic inequities. And so, you know, one of the things that I think is really problematic is the idea that attention focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion is political wokeness, whatever. We're getting a lot of spillover crap from the US, I think, on that. It is fundamental to our economic growth. It is fundamental to innovation. Immigrants are more likely to export. They have knowledge of those markets we're trying to break into. It isn't about being nice. It's about taking advantage of our competitive advantage. So I think we really need to shift the discourse, and we've had a lot of, I can only say garbage, in the media, fueled by social media influencers and so on, that we have to stand up and push back against.
I always love Wendy's straight talk. Glenda, of course, Canada isn't the only country in the world struggling with the sort of the twin demographic pressures of population aging, you know, declining size of the workforce, but also trying to manage the sticky politics of immigration. In the work that you've looked at the OECD, how are successful countries balancing these issues in terms of investing in the skills of their labor force, but also looking at how they grow the labor force? What do you?
Yeah, I think first to go back to the question, so we had our Employment Outlook 2025 this year dedicated to aging. It came out just before the summer, and what we showed is precisely that the growth in GDP per capita, so growth in productivity, is going to slow dramatically if nothing is done, and that mobilizing the workforce is the first step. So, you know, with this simulation, by getting, you know, older workers to retire later, because there's still a lot of early retirement before the official retirement age, women staying longer, mobilizing other labor resources, that's still not enough. So there's an argument for that, and an argument for, as Wendy was saying, is not just to be nice to them, but it is because we need them. So there is an economic argument to get them to participate in the labor force or stay longer. And there is also an argument, though, that even this is not going to be enough. So we need to upskill them and reskill them to make sure all workers, to make sure that productivity per capita of individuals increases, and therefore we are able to go back at least to return to the levels of GDP per capita growth that we had 2 decades ago. And so that's the first point. How are countries? Well, I think countries that, I mean, most countries, I would say all OECD countries are in this situation. So there are no countries that have solved the problem, and they're all doing both things, right? So they're both trying to mobilize workforce, increasing retirement age, but not only, because retirement ages are very high already in most countries. They've already been increased. The problem is people still don't stay until the retirement age. They retire much earlier, in fact, in reality. So For example, things like making adjustments to work, making flexible options more widespread to keep men and women in the labor market for longer, for example. So there's a lot of policies that go beyond skills, and then many are investing precisely in the skills, and all this drive towards skills first approaches is in countries that do particularly well is precisely because they feel skills should be at the center. We need to have the workforce we need to make the most of new technologies, of the green transition, or of, again, addressing demographic trends and so on. So I think they're working on both sides.
Thank you. All right, I see we only have about 3.5 minutes left, and I know the fabulous FSC team that is organizing and keeping us all on track will kill me if we go over time. So let me end this session with one quick question to each of our panelists. This will be rapid fire to each of you, and I'll go in the order that you spoke. If you had an opportunity, and we do have some policy heavy hitters in this room still, so if you had an opportunity to bend their ear and make one evidence-based recommendation that Canada could and should pursue, what would it be?
Oh boy, I have to go first?
Sorry.
Rapid fire. Let me think about this. Well, I mean, I'd go back to the immigration piece. I think we've made some mistakes there. I think we really should focus. We have a lot of lean on the temporary foreign worker program, which is in fact not temporary foreign workers for the most part. They are permanent workers that we need. So I think refocusing on the permanent side of the immigration stream, making sure that we are able to fill those jobs and positions that we have open, that we're welcoming those folks anyways. They should be allowed to be citizens if they're going to be working here.
Thank you. Glenda, you would make?
Yes. Well, I think I'm going to be boring and reiterate the point. I think put skills at the center. I think it addresses a lot of the issues, even the issue of, valorizing, recognizing the skills of migrants. We need to focus on the skills themselves, and not on who we have in front of us, how they've acquired them, where, or their experience. Just focus on skills. And from the side of governments, I think putting in place a common language for skills that's used in the education system, that's used in adult learning, I think is very important to make this focus on skills belong to everyone, including individuals, not just employers and governments and training providers.
Thank you. All right, Wendy, 1.5 minutes, go for it.
I would say, an advertiser once said, half my money's wasted, I don't know which half. I think the thing that would help us drive transformation is if we all linked arms and embraced accountability and outcomes. That should not be a framework that is viewed as a right-wing agenda. Because in the current environment, if we don't start doing what works at scale, replicating things that produce outcomes and getting rid of the stuff that doesn't, including many predatory training programs, I could go on, we will not get where we need to do. So I think accountability and outcomes are absolutely key as we go forward, as well as vision, and how we can use technology to achieve these goals, because there are huge ways that technology can help us with skills assessment, development, and utilization, and we are nowhere near where we need to be with that.
Thank you. Thank you all. Would you join me, please, in thanking the panel? A great discussion.